Hello and welcome back to Am I a Heretic? I'm here today with Father Farge. Father Farge is a spiritual director for many of the priests at Notre Dame Seminary here in New Orleans. Father Farge, how are you doing today?
I'm doing fine, thank you.
That's awesome.
It's day after Thanksgiving, so I'm happy.
Thankful.
Thankful.
Well, I think we can just jump right into the segment and you can
Okay.
grab the first card.
Okay. Any card?
Any card you want.
Okay, let's see. Oh,
Sorry, they all say Am I Heretic on the back, but when you flip it over,
I see.
it'll have the question.
Okay. What is a soul?
What is a soul? So, first and foremost, a soul is the divine aspect of a human. A soul is what makes, well, it's not, a soul isn't explicitly what makes a human because we're also made in the image and likeness of God physically. A soul is it's not inseparable. I can do a lot of saying what it's not, but what is a soul? A soul is our faculty for acting and deciding, but also discernment. So a soul is essential for our ability to choose. Our free will is inherently related to our having a soul. A soul I believe we're ensouled when we are conceived, and a soul is one of the primary distinguishing factors between humans and the rest of God's creation. Well, I got to come up with some kind of answer, so I'll say a soul is the divine aspect of a human individual. It is the faculty for choice. It is God in each human. Well, I haven't overcommitted too much, so maybe I should, but I'll ask you, am I a heretic?
No, I would say you're not a heretic.
That's great.
No, what you say is, I think, correct. You said the soul is the divine aspect. I think I would take it a little bit further.
Okay.
And say the soul is the divine life within a person. So it's not just a part or an aspect of God in the person, but it is God present in the person. And we say that we're made in the image and likeness of God, and that refers to the soul, not as much to the body, but to the soul. Of course, the soul, in a sense, is embodied in our physical existence. And it's not completely two separate things, but it is the divine life. And so I think if we were able to see our soul, we would be amazed that if we're in the state of grace, that it looks like God. It appears as God would appear.
Would it look like an angel? But
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
A spirit. It would look like an angel. Mm-hmm. Yes.
I have another question.
Yeah.
Does Jesus, as fully human and fully God, have a soul?
Yes, it's a divine and human soul.
Interesting.
So he has a divine and human nature. And that means he has a divine and human soul. So we have a human nature, so we have a human soul. But our human soul lives for eternity. And I don't know if we want to get into what the devil is, but the devil does not see our soul because the devil cannot see God. So the devil knows we have a soul, but doesn't know what it looks like. So that's why he tempts us to sin. If the devil could see our soul, he wouldn't even try to tempt us, because he sees how much it looks like God, how much it
really
resembles
interesting. That led me to another question.
Mm-hmm.
Where does the Catholic belief of the soul come from? Like, when along Catholicism did the doctrine of a soul come about? Like, or where in Scripture are we, concluding that we have a soul from?
So I think the description of the soul, as explained by Thomas Aquinas, would have come from Aristotle. So Aristotle believed in a soul and believed in an immortal soul. Where in Scripture is it? So Jesus talks about the reward or the punishment that we will have for what we do, and promises that we will be with him for all eternity. So from that we can conclude there must be some aspect of us that will last for all eternity. And we know it's not the body, because the body dies, becomes corrupted. So the aspect of us that lives forever, we give the term soul. I think St. Paul uses the term in his letters. So that's why we know there's a soul. But I think we also know there's a soul, even for a person who doesn't have faith can conclude that they are not only a physical body, because they do have longings that are not satisfied by anything in this world. And even though they may not term that longing a longing for God, that's what it is.
That makes sense. I was having a conversation with an agnostic friend of mine recently, self-described agnostic, and we were talking about whether or not we have free will, and we both agreed that we do have free will. And he was perfectly happy to make the jump to having a soul as a corollary of having free will and the capacity to choose. And I thought, well, that's a pretty interesting conclusion for somebody who describes himself as agnostic, to be willing to make, because we don't, well, at least as far as I see it, we don't see a lot of physical evidence, as I would call it, as a materialist would call it, of having a soul, but rather a emotional feeling, maybe I could describe it, of having the capacity to choose and having the longings as you described.
Yeah. I think the problem that people have with free will or determinism is because it's hard for us to be free, to make free choices, because we have attachments to possessions and attachments to places, and we want to stay in our hometown, and so we're not completely free, say, to take a risk and go to another place, or go to another city to take a new job. We're not completely free to do that, and we're not completely free in a lot of things. So people can conclude sometimes that we don't have freedom, that we're determined.
That's interesting.
And that's one of the purposes, as you probably know, of the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius is to achieve some kind of freedom so that we can make a free choice.
That makes sense. I heard an example one time about freedom. You know, when I sit down at a piano, I have the freedom to hit any of the keys. What I don't have is the freedom to play for Elise because I haven't practiced the piano. I mean, maybe if I did it, you know, an infinite number of times, I might statistically randomly hit the exact sequence of keys that would be necessary.
Yeah.
But I don't have the freedom to choose to do that. But it's as a result of my lack of practice, not as a result of some external force limiting what I can do on a piano.
That's right, yeah. So in that sense, our freedom is limited by our abilities, talents. We can't do anything. Only God has complete freedom.
That makes sense. Well, I don't think I was a heretic, but I don't think I got what a soul was very right. But I think I could perhaps describe it better now. And first and foremost, it is the divine life in us. That's awesome.
What happened to Jesus in the tomb?
What happened to Jesus in the tomb? This is a good one. Okay. I mean, I hardly know. Let's see. So Jesus, maybe I can just recap to help myself remember. Jesus died on the cross, lanced in the side, and water flowed from his side. And the cloth on the altar in the temple tore. And then he was laid in the tomb, and Mary Magdalene, most likely, and maybe some others, maybe one or two others, found the rock moved. And I believe they did not go inside at the time, but rather ran to John and Peter, maybe?
Yeah.
And then when they went back to the tomb, they looked inside and found only the cloth that Jesus was wrapped in. And you'd want to, well, and there's some historical context that I think should be applied here. You'd want to wrap a dead body laid in a tomb almost in a mummy type way, and I think they probably did the same thing to Lazarus, which is an interesting parallel in the Gospels. So we would expect that they would use something along those lines, and that's probably what they found in there. But it's also very interesting to note that in the Gospels, it's recorded as women finding the tomb open, because this would be, from what I understand, very embarrassing for John or Peter to admit that a woman found them, especially in their time. And it's not about ego or, you know, recording John as the greatest. And John loves to write how much he's the greatest, right? He loves to say, you know, the one whom Jesus loved. And of course, I'm joking a bit, but
No, I see what you mean.
it seems pretty significant that they recorded it exactly as it happened, exactly as they at least knew, or at least was revealed to them as it happened. And they found no trace of Jesus' body in the tomb. So then, you know, what on earth happened? And there's a few good materialist theories. He dug a hole. That's ridiculous. I don't think he pulled a Shawshank Redemption on him. Somebody moved the rock and removed him.
Except there were Roman guards there.
There were Roman guards there, and the Roman guards would not let that happen. And also, if Peter and John removed the rock, like maybe they knocked out the Roman guards, removed the rock, took Jesus, hid his body somewhere, and then said he had resurrected, I don't understand why they would say that 2 women found the tomb open. I just don't think that theory quite fits. Then, of course, there's also the possibility that Jesus rose from the dead. But then we get some interesting lines, in particular in like the Nicene Creed and the Apostles' Creed. He descended into hell, or the language around that is often unclear. It can make things a little more cloudy than they perhaps should be, because I believe the original word was the same word that the Jews or the Israelites would have used for the place of the dead, rather than
Sheol,
what we
Sheol.
mean by hell for the most part. And then he ascended into heaven. And heaven would have been like a new thing at the time.
That's right. Nobody would have been in heaven.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a kind of a non-answer. That's my recounting of what seems to be the evidence for what happened to Jesus in the tomb. But I don't know. Am I a heretic?
No, you're not a heretic, but you talked very correctly and accurately about what happened when Jesus died, and what happened, or what might have happened after he died and after he was buried. But you don't really answer the question, what happened to Jesus in the tomb?
Fair.
Should I want to try it again?
Oh dear. Okay. That's a great. I mean, I'm not sure I have any good idea.
So I could give you a kind of hint.
I'd love to take a hint.
So Lazarus was in the tomb.
Okay.
So what's the difference between what happened to Lazarus in the tomb and what happened to Jesus in the tomb?
Okay, that's a good hint. I like that hint. So I think the big difference between those two is Lazarus couldn't raise himself, couldn't come back himself. But Jesus, being fully God and fully man, did have the capacity to raise Lazarus and had the ability to raise himself. I think that's where you were going with the hint, but I don't know that I took it far enough. I don't feel like I've answered the question really at all. But
so Lazarus died, was buried, and Jesus rose him from the dead, brought him back to life. But the life to which he was brought back was, again, his own human life.
Okay.
And he would have died at some point again. So that Jesus, what happened in the tomb was he was restored to life, brought back to life, but that life was different. It was a new life. It wasn't the same life, so he wasn't going to die again. It was a divine life, and he would be alive forever, for eternity. And so some of the scriptures indicate that he rose from the dead by the power of the Father, God the Father, and others indicate he raised himself from the dead. Regardless, it means the same thing. God rose from the dead. and that life is eternal life. It's divine life, and that refers back to the life of the soul that we discussed before. The life of our soul is divine life. It's not human life that is limited by time. So, so what happened to Jesus in the tomb was he was given, or he was raised from human life to divine life.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
But does he retain his fully human person?
So,
or am I saying that wrong?
Yeah. So Jesus is not a human person. He has a human. Jesus is a divine person.
Divine person.
Yeah. So if we say he's a human person and a divine person, we're saying he's two persons.
Okay.
But he's one person.
He's one person.
So he's a divine person that has a human nature and a divine nature.
Nature was the word I meant to use.
Yeah.
I see. Okay. I got too close to being a heretic there.
You were close to being a heretic. Is there sufficient reason to restrict the Latin Mass?
Oh, I'm just so happy this one came up. What's amazing is in God's providence, we've had some fantastic questions come up at the most opportune moments doing the show already. And this is a great question because you celebrate the traditional Latin Mass at St. Patrick's downtown.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm really glad this question came up. And I'm going to give it my best. This one, I might be a heretic on this one. But I would say, well, first of all, I don't know very much about 170 countries around the world. I know a good bit about one, and that country is the United States. So I don't necessarily know what's going on in other parts of the world, and perhaps there are perfectly good reasons that we should adhere to the Second Vatican Council, and traditional Latin Mass in some parts of the world is in fact being used to intentionally subvert some of the teachings. And we do need, so there's the three S's of Catholic social teaching. Sustainability, well, I don't know where I started with this. Sustainability, solidarity, and subsidiarity. And they're all essential pieces, and we do need the solidarity piece because we can't have a fractured Catholic Church. We can't be split into a million different factions that are disagreeing on different things, and we need the subsidiarity because that subsidiarity, that leadership of popes and cardinals and bishops that exists for a great reason, and that's to help us maintain the other two, the sustainability and the solidarity. But I'll approach it as an American, having seen what I've seen in America and having read what I've read of some of the recent popes' works. I do not think there is a sufficient reason to restrict the Latin Mass because it hasn't changed. The teachings that we have about opening up Mass to being said in contemporary languages makes a lot of sense. It makes sense for people to be able to go to Mass and understand the words that are being said because it's being spoken in their native tongue. But the High Solemn Mass hasn't changed. Really, I mean, for probably 1,000+ years. Mm-hmm. So I don't really see anything in Vatican II that would say the traditional Latin Mass has significantly changed in a way where it's no longer cohesive with the Catholic Church's teachings. So I'm definitely at risk of being a heretic on this one. But I'd say, from what I know, no, there is not sufficient reason to restrict the Latin Mass. And I'm super excited to hear your answer on this, but I got to ask you first, am I a heretic?
Well, if you are a heretic, I am a heretic also, because I agree with you. You talked about there should be unity, but there doesn't have to be uniformity. So, for example, there are 23 Eastern Rite liturgies within the Catholic Church. And those Eastern rites are in union with the Pope, in union with the Catholic Church. And those rites are completely different from our Novus Ordo Mass or our Latin Mass, traditional Latin Mass. So that shows that there can be unity, but there doesn't have to be uniformity. We don't have to be all the same. And you mentioned that, it's good if people understand the readings, and the readings are in their own language. I think so too. But I've talked to people after celebrating an English Mass, and just out of curiosity, asked them what the gospel reading was. And they can't remember what it was, even though they heard it in their own language. And when people go to a Latin Mass, usually they have a missal, so they're following along. So if I ask them, what was the gospel reading, they can tell me, because they were reading it in English at the same time that they were hearing it in Latin. And the English Mass, of course, has a much broader spectrum of the scriptures. You hear much more of the Bible if you go to English Mass than you do the Latin Mass. But I wonder if people who go to the traditional Latin Mass, even though they hear less of the Bible, understand the scriptures less than a person who goes to the English Mass every Sunday.
That's interesting. Well, here's a question, because I think we've got a good wide range of viewership. Why would you have Mass in Latin? What's the reason for having a traditional Latin Mass, especially today, when no one speaks Latin?
No one speaks Latin, but I think you have it because people want it. People desire it.
I'm certainly one of the people that desires it. Mm-hmm. I find Latin to be regal. It feels appropriate for God in the presence of Christ in the Eucharist to be using a majestic language like Latin. And sung Latin is so beautiful and noble.
You mentioned Vatican II, and so the document on the liturgy in Vatican II says that Latin should be retained, and also Gregorian chant should be preserved in the liturgy. And but somehow, when the new Mass was developed, we did away with Latin completely, and Gregorian chant also, which is against Vatican II, what Vatican II intended. Mhm.
How do these correct themselves over time? Because, I'm sure there's been ebbs and flows in the Catholic Church's history. I
Yeah.
mean, there's been some very serious ebbs and flows in the
Mm-hmm.
Catholic Church's
Mm-hmm.
history. So, what mechanics are in place to repair some of these mistakes and bring um, the church back onto the course that perhaps that council intended?
Yeah, so I don't think it can be done by legislation or by orders of the Pope or a motu proprio or something like that. I think it has to develop organically, develop naturally.
Mm.
I think people have to, and the hierarchy has to begin to see that there's a purpose for using Latin. And I think one of the purposes is, you probably know it, if you've been to Orthodox liturgy or seen an Orthodox church, they have the iconostas,
Eastern?
the Eastern,
Yeah, I've been to one or two.
and there's a wall with icons,
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes you can barely see the altar and what the priest is doing. And that was true even in the Roman Rite also for a long time. So if you go to the cathedral in Milan, that the wall is still there. And it looks like a Greek Orthodox or Russian Orthodox church.
That's interesting.
And that wall, the purpose of the wall was to give the liturgy a sense of mystery, that you don't see everything. And so the Latin language is not a physical wall, but it's a iconostas. It functions the same way to give the liturgy a sense of mystery.
Well, that seems to make sense to me because it would serve, at least to me, it would serve as a reminder that we can't see everything. And in Christ's presence in the Eucharist, we can't see Christ's presence in the Eucharist.
Yeah.
So it's like it would remind me of why we're here, why we're at Mass.
Uh-huh. Yeah, we can't see everything, and we can't understand everything either about the Mass. And, people say, I want to go to the English Mass because I can understand it, but I think they understand less about what the Mass is, what it really is, than people who go to the traditional Mass.
So I have a corollary question.
Mm-hmm.
At least following from a layperson's perspective, it seems like, or I hear on social media about things, that the Latin Mass has been restricted. Has it?
Yes. Yes, it has.
It has.
Mm-hmm.
How so? What are those restrictions?
Well, according to the motu proprio, the restrictions are that a priest cannot say on a Sunday both an English Mass and a Latin Mass. A Latin Mass cannot be held in a parish church. It has to be in a hall or another place. What else? The bishop of a diocese has to give approval and has to designate the places where the Latin Mass could be celebrated.
Well, that one seems to make some sense to me. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it seems to make sense to have approval from your bishop to do things.
Yeah.
But the first two seem kind of odd or
So,
surprising.
yeah, as you know, not every bishop is implementing those restrictions. Some dioceses are, but not all of them.
And what's going on if they don't? Is there
Nothing
in
happens
particular?
apparently. So Archbishop Aymon is not implementing some of the restrictions. So he allows the Latin Mass in the church, in the parish church, and he allows priests to if they need to celebrate both on the same day, a Latin Mass and an English Mass.
What would be the motivation for not being able to say both in the same day?
The motivation would be that one kind of Mass, one kind of liturgy is more desirable than two different kinds of liturgies.
Makes some sense.
Some sense, yeah, it makes some sense. But so I'm restricted. I have restrictions that are new. So I'm free to celebrate traditional Mass at St. Patrick's Church or at any of the other 5 churches in New Orleans that are designated locations for the Latin Mass. And I can, on a weekday, I can celebrate a private Latin Mass here, but the restriction is no one can be present at the Mass I celebrate. So that's a new restriction as
Can somebody
of
come celebrate
summer.
like with you?
No one can be present.
Wow.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I mean, as a layperson, it sounds really strange. I mean,
I think that's enforced by the Archbishop, and I think his intention to restrict it to 6 places is so that he knows what's going on. And Jesuit High School is not one of those 6 places.
oh, okay.
So it shouldn't be celebrated here. But he said if you want to celebrate it, you can celebrate it privately, but no one should be present because it's
that
not
makes
a
some sense.
designated location for the Latin Mass.
I mean, I understand the logic of like the Archbishop should know what's going on in his
Mm-hmm.
Area,
Mm-hmm.
and if it's not one of the locations, then at least it's almost, it seems to me like it's generous to allow you to do it even
Mm-hmm.
in solitude.
Yeah.
But I just question why some of these restrictions are necessary.
Yeah. So before, when people were allowed to be at a Mass, sometimes students would come. I'd celebrate in the 2nd floor chapel downstairs. And we have 2 scholastics here, 2 Jesuit scholastics, and one of them would serve for me, but now he can't serve Mass for me.
Wow. That's crazy.
Mm-hmm. But I think, the present pontiff will not be pope forever, and when it changes, I think some of the restrictions will be
Lifted.
lifted.
That was awesome. I'm really glad we got to do that question with you.
Yeah.